On Wednesday, July the 18th, Barbara Freitas was murdered by an impatient driver that cut around another car, through the bike lane at a high rate of speed. The 68-year-old driver then crashed into some parked cars halfway down the block. He's fine, but Barbara is now dead. Her story is such a tragedy because anyone who has ever biked in Philly has seen countless selfish asshole drivers that risk the lives of people outside of cars daily. And even though we cannot change the habits of every single driver, good infrastructure can mitigate the risk of having fatal accidents. And the best way to fix many of these problems is to give cars and bikes dedicated protected lanes separate from each other. But Philadelphia has, of course, half-assed many of these lanes, and today I want to talk about the specific one that Barbara was killed in by a driver that couldn't wait another 15 seconds. The Spruce and Pine Street bike lanes are some of the most heavily used bike lanes in the city. They stretch from the Delaware waterfront across Center City and end a few blocks from the Schuylkill River Trail. These lanes are unprotected, with just flex posts at the ends of the blocks. But with these streets only having one lane of car traffic, speeds generally stay relatively tame, or at least one would hope. Car traffic routinely gets congested, especially west of Broad Street, meaning that biking is usually the fastest way to get across the city. So many residents, commuters, and tourists use these bike lanes to traverse east and west throughout Center City, as it's the best way to get across the southern half of Rittenhouse and Old City. But even if biking is the fastest way to get across the city, it is far from the safest. There are many issues with the Spruce and Pine Street bike lanes, and most of the problems stem from the fact that these lanes are unprotected and that paint is not infrastructure. Constantly across the whole east-west run, you see entitled parked or standing drivers blocking the lanes because they're only going to be there a few minutes. This creates problem number one. Bikers have to look behind them and merge into the faster car traffic, which sucks both for biking but also for the car drivers who are temporarily slowed down. I see you in the comments, the same people that will complain about bikes getting in the way of your car and slowing you down. Maybe you should give a shit about cars parked in the bike lane. Just a thought. And the second biggest issue with these unprotected lanes is cars coming into the bike lanes just to pass other cars. I'm sorry you made the mistake of driving a car into a dense city. That's your fault, brainiac. And now you have to deal with the same dorks that also decided to bring their lard barges into Center City. But no, you're so much more important than everyone else, so you have to get in front by all means necessary. And that means going through the bike lane, obviously. And this is why we need physical infrastructure like concrete curbs and bollards to separate the bike lanes and the car lanes. Because the second a room temperature IQ car driver decides to accelerate around someone else parallel parking and they use the bike lane and don't look, they are going to kill or hurt someone. And we saw exactly that happen last week. So why is something like this even allowed to happen? Well, let's talk about why the Spruce and Pine Street bike lanes are unprotected. There are three main parties that are at fault here, so let's go over them one by one. Let's start with the people most at fault for allowing our fellow Philadelphians to die in these bike lanes, the neighborhood RCOs. Philadelphia is one of America's biggest cities, and with that, it has some very weird ways of delegating some of the civic oversight of infrastructure to groups of people. The oversight of large portions of the city and multiple neighborhoods is given to council members, which we'll get to later. But individual neighborhoods do have some control over themselves through the use of RCOs, or registered community organizations. And those RCOs do have a large say over how our streets are managed. The Spruce and Pine bike lanes travel through three different RCOs: the Center City Residents Association, the Washington Square West Civic Association, and the Society Hill Civic Association. All of these RCOs are responsible for community meetings and input on how the streets are planned in their districts when Philly wants to redesign a street. So, in 2009, when the bike lanes were to be installed, the residents of all three RCOs pushed back on having the bike lanes protected with the bare minimum, which was flex posts. Their reasoning? They wanted to be able to park their cars for a short time in the bike lane to drop off or pick up items from their buildings. Did you know that Center City property owners are incapable of processing this specific image in their brain? I didn't know that either. And the story gets worse because in November 2017, a different cyclist was killed at 11th and Spruce, in the same bike lane that Barbara was killed in, just on the other side of Center City. Well, of course we can't protect the bike lane. I don't care about people dying. I'm a selfish asshole that needs to unload my car. So nothing changed even after her death. All the city did was install the current flex posts at the ends of the blocks with the thought that it would persuade drivers not to run over bikers while turning. So we come to the current day where 2 cyclists have been killed because the neighborhood RCOs are selfish and wanted to keep temporary parking instead of properly protecting riders. So if you live in any of these neighborhoods that the RCOs cover, I recommend going to their meetings and getting in contact with them to voice your opinions on wanting protected bike lanes instead of temporary parking access. I will link the map below where you can search for your RCO and find the info for your neighborhood. So next, let's talk about what Philly politicians are doing. Like I mentioned earlier, large sections of the city are covered by specific council people, and one of the councilmen that covers the Spruce and Pine bike lanes is notorious for not giving a shit about pedestrian and bike safety. Councilman Kenyatta Johnson has proven time and time again that he does not care for bike infrastructure and safety. This was largely proven in the Washington Ave redesign that happened in 2022. Washington Ave is a notoriously bad stroad that traverses South Philly. Vehicular crashes, pedestrian injuries, and deaths were not uncommon with how badly the road was designed. So in 2022, when the road was going to be repaved, it gave the city an opportunity to fix these issues. Except there was one big issue. Mark Squilla, the councilman of District 1, only had oversight of the section of Washington Ave that was east of Broad Street, and Kenyatta Johnson oversaw the section west of Broad Street. Squilla has always been pretty positive on making safe improvements with bike infrastructure, so his redesigned section of Washington Ave generally ended up looking like this. Notice the parking protected bike lanes and the road dieted lanes. And on the other hand, there was our boy KJ's section, which looked about as uninspiring as his last corruption scandal. If you'd like to know more about the nonsense of this redesign, I recommend watching Alex Davis's video on it. And with that knowledge of Washington Ave, how has Kenyatta responded to the recent death in the Spruce Street bike lane? Well, he didn't show up to the vigil. Instead, a council member from an adjacent district showed up, and he didn't show up to the press conference that the DA held with other politicians, and he gave some half-assed excuse on Twitter why he didn't. So, if you live in his district and you'd like to change his mind on getting protected bike lanes, I put all of his contact info for his office down in the description. Besides him, let's talk briefly about Mayor Parker. Parker seems to have no plans for improving bike or pedestrian infrastructure, and I highly doubt she has any empathy for such causes, because she would probably never see herself on a bike, but would probably see herself in a situation more similar to the man that killed Dr. Freitas. Just a hunch, though. If you do want to attempt to change her mind, here's the office number, but please pity the staffers that have to man the phones. And finally, there's one more entity that we have to talk about, the churches. Along Spruce and Pine Street, there are 4 large churches that for some reason have the ability to park legally in the bike lanes on Sundays. This is a holdover from before the bike lanes existed, but it's an absolute insult now. These churches, like the RCOs mentioned before, were one of the main sources of opposition to making the bike lanes protected. And it's just so they can park there on Sundays. There have been some activists recently that have been hosting parties in the bike lanes on Sunday mornings, blocking drivers from parking in the bike lane on Spruce Street. This is largely focused on the biggest offender, the 10th Presbyterian Church of Philadelphia. And as someone who grew up going to a Presbyterian church, this is an insult to other churches of the same faith who would gladly listen to these advocates. Opposing a protected bike lane for parking on Sundays is genuinely insane, especially when these policy choices have led to 2 deaths already. Maybe it's me, but I seem to be forgetting the part of the Bible where Jesus selfishly opposes a walking path because he wants to park his donkey there, and then accidentally kills his neighbor in the process. Do better. Philadelphia is headed in the right direction whether these boat anchor of fossils like it or not. Neighboring cities like Washington, D.C., NYC, and Boston are building protected bike lanes way better than Philly, and people recognize those investments in their future. Our neighbors and politicians have the option to be remembered as people who cared, or as someone who just got in the way of progress. Especially those who believe in a racial equality, having better pedestrian and bike infrastructure helps lift up the most disenfranchised populations of Philadelphia. If our politicians like Kenyatta Johnson and Mayor Parker actually cared about making the city a safer place, fixing our dangerous streets would be one of their top priorities. If they do not fix the streets, the younger generations are ready to take over and fix things themselves. Because I want to build a city that's for everyone, not just people who drive cars. Thank you always to my Patreons. You allow me to make videos like this that are very heated, where I'm not tied to a sponsor or any other entity.